In the memoirs of German soldiers and officers, there are different assessments of the actions of the Soviet army during the assault on their positions. Some Germans said how desperate the Russians were in the attack, how quickly and skillfully the Soviets attacked the positions and captured the German trenches. Other Germans recalled how Soviet commanders misused their soldiers by throwing them into frontal attacks. One of the Soviet veterans wrote in his memoirs that our command rarely used evasive maneuvers when storming settlements, storming German trenches head-on. As a result, at every village, at every even small German stronghold, a whole cemetery of Soviet soldiers grew up. On the other hand, the Germans who took part in the battles for Leningrad on the Nevsky Patch, at the very beginning of the war, said that the Russian command was weak and the soldiers were literally doomed to death. But we all saw how brave the Russians were. You don't know what to be more surprised about: the madness of those who ordered this hopeless operation, or the courage of the suicide bombers who carried it out. And in a German newspaper there appeared the following lines: "The Russian soldier surpasses our adversary in the West by his contempt for death. Stamina and fatalism make him hold on until he is killed in a trench or falls dead in hand-to-hand combat." The psychological paralysis which usually followed lightning-fast German breakthroughs in the West is not observed to the same extent in the East. For the most part, the enemy not only maintains his ability to act, but in turn, attempts to envelop the German pincers. The Russians have proved themselves skillful, hardy, and fearless soldiers, shattering our former prejudices of racial superiority. Here's another episode about the misguided actions of Soviet commanders on the battlefield, when in a day, in just a couple hours, the division lost half of its personnel. This is a clipping from the diary of a Soviet soldier. That day we received the order to take the initial position in the area of the railroad bed. The task was to advance straight ahead and only forward. Our trenches were 1.5 kilometers away from the positions where the soldiers of the other unit were defending. The terrain was open, quite flat. The Germans shot along and across. And as soon as our rifle division moved from this line to attack, the enemy opened hurricane fire on us, and we began to lose our personnel. Those soldiers who had damaged personal weapons through them immediately grabbed another from a killed comrade and ran forward and only forward. Then the slope began, and 200 meters away from it there was a forest. And there were trenches on this slope to the forest, where our soldiers from another unit were keeping defense. They asked us, "Where are you running to?" We answered them, "To the attack." And they answered us, "To attack from over there." And they point forward into the forest, to a neutral zone 100 meters away from us. Before starting the attack, we had to bypass the open field and attack from the forest. The division lost 1/3 of its personnel in such confusion and lay down. On the other hand, the German generals had completely opposite opinions about the Soviet soldiers. Von Kleist said that the Russians from the beginning showed themselves as first-class warriors, and our successes in the first months of the war were simply due to better training. Gaining battle experience, the Russians became excellent soldiers. They fought with exceptional tenacity, had remarkable endurance, and could withstand the most intense battles. And German General Johannes Friesner recalled, "In the course of the war, I watched as the Soviet command became more and more experienced. Quite rightly, the Soviet High Command, starting from Stalingrad, often exceeded all our expectations. It masterfully carried out rapid maneuver and troop movements, the transfer of the direction of the main blow, showed skill in creating bridgeheads and equipping them with initial positions for the subsequent transition to the offensive." German non-commissioned officer Felix Tenning also left in his diaries memories of the Soviet assaults. In these memories there is both sadness and pride for the Soviet soldiers. They went into the attack doomed, without hope for success, but they went. And most importantly, they did not surrender to the Germans' counterattacks. Reckless heroes, eternal memory to them. They went on the attack again. Crowded and howling, with the stubbornness of the doomed. As if they were all being sent to the firing squad. They run without trying to dodge the bullets we meet them with. They don't try to get closer by running across the road, falling, rolling, rolling, running and falling again. They don't try to run the way everyone else is taught to run, and they probably don't either. They just run and don't even shoot. They face death the same way. I guess living that life, they don't fully appreciate it, their own or anyone else's. A month ago I saw 3 Russian soldiers being shot. I don't know what they did. One had a gas mask wrapped around his foot instead of a shoe. They didn't beg, they didn't beat hysterically, they just stood there and looked at the soldiers who were to shoot them, who didn't like the execution as much. They stood against each other, the Germans were shooting, the Russians were falling. As if, now they would lie down, get up and leave. The German soldiers also seemed to be grateful to them in their hearts for this behavior. Today, just like yesterday, they ran from their trenches across the field to a bend in the terrain, which is 300 meters. They ran and took shelter there from our bullets and from the shouts of their commissars. They lay there until dark and then crawled back. The main thing here is not to do anything stupid and not to try to counterattack them, like we did a few days ago. We were wrong, the Russians did not run and did not surrender. Although we shelled them with mortars for half an hour before the attack, they defended themselves just as doomed. And the losses on our side were inexcusably high that day. Once behind the slope, only then do they cautiously begin to fire in the direction of our machine gun, as it poses the greatest mortal threat to them. For the second day we have been employing a not very clever ruse. We dig up a small bush with roots, put it on an embankment near our cover, and while they are only running, we fire from under it. Then, when they catch their breath behind the slope, we move the bush 50 meters to the right, and all the bullets fly there. We do not give ourselves away, in case they want to continue the attack, despite the fact that for these 200 or 300 meters on the field remained lying a third of those who went into it. And here are the memories of the heroism of Soviet soldiers left by German officer Bruno Windsor. The task, for the sake of which the war was started, turned out to be unattainable. During one march my company was stopped at a site where the Russians had built for themselves convenient shelters. The first platoon came under heavy rifle and machine gun fire, with which it was met by the Russians. The platoon commander tried to bypass and destroy the firing point, but wherever he directed his unit, it everywhere encountered vigorous resistance. It seemed that the Russians concentrated here a company, if not a whole battalion. Apparently, our intelligence was deeply miscalculated. Then I ordered the second platoon to advance to the right through the forest in a wide arc, while the third platoon went around to the left to attack the enemy from the rear. Such purely infantry tactics have always helped us. It succeeded this time, but the attack lasted more than 4 hours. In the meantime, the road on which the troops were moving was blocked. Behind us, other units were piled up. The Russians fired from all barrels, then there was silence. Undoubtedly, both my platoons had outflanked the enemy and forced him to cease resistance. Slowly, from cover to cover, we approached the wood and structure. But what we saw there astonished us greatly. The Russian position was not a fortified structure at all, but only a primitive shelter made of light tree trunks on which the earth had been piled. The shelter had room for only 8 men. Around the position were scattered camp flasks, cooking utensils, and many shell casings. Behind a small earthen berm lay 3 dead Soviet soldiers. But the machine gun from which they had fired had disappeared. They had taken it with them when they ran out of ammunition. Consequently, we were not fighting against a battalion, or a company, or even a full platoon. A small group of soldiers held us up for 4 hours, forced us to turn around, inflicted casualties on us, and then fled. Similar situations were repeated many times, and each time it turned out that it was only a few Red Army soldiers who huddled in extremely skillfully chosen positions and forced us to take the fight. One day we also came under intense machine gun fire from the flank. It was simply impossible to pass on the road. 2 non-commissioned officers and 3 soldiers were already lying dead between the vehicles, while we took cover and surveyed the terrain with binoculars. Finally we spotted a machine gun behind a haystack. 4 guns and 8 machine guns opened fire. The bursts were clearly visible, but the Soviet machine gun kept firing. We were delayed for almost 2 hours. Again behind us stood waiting for other large units of the division. Then we saw one soldier run from the stack, picking up a machine gun. Everyone raised their rifles and, standing, began firing at the fugitive, but he still managed to reach the woods and escape. One single soldier paralyzed the action of the largest part of the division for 2 hours, for we found no dead at the haystack. There were only empty shell casings and a duffel bag. He had thrown his sack, but not his machine gun. The ability to organize the defense I consider the strongest point of the Soviet troops. One of the reasons for this lies in the very national character of the Russians. The ability of the Russian soldier to endure everything and die in his trench is an important prerequisite for a persistent and fierce defense. It is complemented by a strong connection of the Russian soldier with nature, which allows him in defense to masterfully equip their positions and camouflage perfectly. In addition, the Russian infantry was superior to the German infantry in a number of important issues of combat training and armament. In particular, the Russians were superior to the Germans in the art of night fighting, fighting in wooded and swampy terrain and fighting in winter, in the training of snipers and in the engineering of positions, as well as in equipping the infantry with machine guns and mortars, said German officer Ike Mitteldorf.